key wisdom is to create opportunities for mischief makers as well as truth seekers. And when the subject is World War II, the opportunities to make mischief are legion. Yet the club wielded by the Washington-Hollywood axis of illusion should not deter historians from accepting the revisionist challenge. Nor should the prospect of sharing a dais with someone like me, who, while conceding that the so-called isolationists of the 1930s got some things wrong, will also insist that they got a whole lot right. And much of what they got right deserves respectful consideration today. So if someone like Charles Beard may not merit 3 lusty cheers, he deserves at least 1, and perhaps even 2. To illustrate the possibilities of revisionist inquiry, let me advance the following broad proposition for your consideration. For citizens of the 21st century, the 20th century actually has 2 quite different stories to tell. The first story is familiar, although imperfectly understood. The second is little known, with large implications that have gone almost entirely ignored. Enshrined today as a story of freedom besieged but ultimately triumphant, the familiar story began back in 1914 and continued until its apparently definitive conclusion in 1989. Call this the short 20th century. The less familiar alternative recounts a story in which freedom as such has figured only intermittently. It has centered on the question of who will dominate the region that we today call the Greater Middle East. Also kicking into high gear in 1914, this story continues to unfold in the present day with no end in sight. Call this the story of the long 20th century. The short 20th century, geographically centered on Eurasia, pitted great powers against one another. Although alignments shifted depending on circumstance, the roster of major players remained fairly constant. That roster consisted of Great Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan, with the United States biding its time before eventually picking up most of the marbles. From time to time, the long 20th century also pitted great powers against one another. Yet that struggle has always had a second element. It has been a contest between outsiders and insiders. Western intruders with large ambitions, preeminently Great Britain, until succeeded by the United States, pursued their dreams of empire or hegemony, typically cloaked in professions of benevolent assimilation, uplift, or the pursuit of world peace. The beneficiaries of these imperial administrations, from Arabs in North Africa to Moros in the southern Philippines, along with sundry groups in between, seldom proved grateful and frequently resisted. The short 20th century had a moral and ideological aspect. If not especially evident at first, this became clearer over time. Viewed in retrospect, President Woodrow Wilson's effort to portray the cataclysm of 1914-1918 as a struggle of democracy versus militarism appears more than a little strained. The problem is not that Germany was innocent of the charge of militarism. It is rather that Western theories of democracy in those days left more than a little to be desired. After all, those who labored under the yoke of British, French, and American rule across large swaths of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East enjoyed precious little freedom and no democracy at all. Yet the advent of the Third German Reich produced a moral clarity hitherto more theoretical than real. The war against Nazi Germany was, indubitably, a war on behalf of liberal democracy against vile, murderous totalitarianism. Of course, sustaining that construct is easier if you survey the events of World War II with one eye covered. The central event of the short 20th century loses some of its moral luster once you acknowledge the following. First, concern for the fate of European Jewry exercised no discernible influence on Allied conduct in the war. Allied forces failing to make any serious attempt to avert, halt, or even retard the final solution. Second, in both Europe and the Pacific, Allied strategic bombing campaigns killed non-combatants indiscriminately on a scale dwarfing, let us say, the atrocity of 9/11. Third, the price of liberating Western Europe included the enslavement of Eastern Europeans, a direct consequence of allocating to Uncle Joe Stalin's Red Army primary responsibility for defeating the Wehrmacht. Fourth, at war's end, the victors sanctioned campaigns of ethnic cleansing on a scale not seen before or since. They also did not hesitate to offer employment to scientists, engineers, and intelligence operatives who had served Adolf Hitler. And fifth, on the American home front, the war fought for freedom and democracy left intact a well-entrenched system of de facto apartheid, racial equality not numbering among Franklin Roosevelt's four freedoms. None of these disturbing facts, it need hardly be said, made any significant impact on the way World War II became enshrined in American memory. I do not recall encountering any of them while watching Victory at Sea. Yet these facts matter. They remind us that if the short 20th century was sometimes about values, it was always about politics and power. The Allies who joined together to defeat the Axis, a righteous cause, did not hesitate to employ means that were anything but righteous. In pursuit of that righteous cause, they simultaneously connived and jockeyed against one another for relative advantage on matters related to oil, territory, markets, and the preservation of imperial privilege. Now, whether out of conscience or out of expediency, the onset of the post-war era soon enough prompted Americans to rethink some, if not all, of the morally dubious practices that made it necessary to sanitize the narrative of World War II. So after 1945, liberal democracies, the United States now in the vanguard, turned on the left-wing totalitarianism that had played such a crucial role in the fight against right-wing totalitarianism. No longer a valued ally, Stalin became the new Hitler. At home, meanwhile, the United States also began to amend the pronounced defects in its own approach to democratic practice. However haltingly, for example, the modern civil rights movement commenced. Both of these facilitated efforts by Cold Warriors to infuse the anti-communist crusade, which succeeded the anti-Axis crusade, with a certain moral clarity. The ensuing struggle between an American-led West and a Soviet-led East, in their view, deserved to be seen as an extension of World War II. As with World War II, therefore, so too with the Cold War. American leaders insistently framed the contest in ideological rather than geopolitical terms. The free world ostensibly asked nothing more than that freedom itself should survive. This served to camouflage the real stakes. Rival powers, previous wars, having now reduced their ranks to two, were vying for primacy in Eurasia. That contest now reaching its concluding chapter. This framing device had important implications when the era of bipolarity came to its abrupt and surprising end. I don't know about you, but recalling the events that unfolded between 1978, when John Paul II became Pope, and 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, still makes me dizzy. Right before our very eyes, history had seemingly handed down a conclusive verdict. The search for alternatives to liberal democratic capitalism had failed. That failure was definitive. The short 20th century was kaput. Born 1914, died 1989. Fini. Well, during what turned out to be a very abbreviated post-Cold War era, American politicians and commentators vied with one another to devise a suitably grandiose conception of what the passing of the short 20th century signified. Whatever the specifics, the results were sure to be very good and very long-lasting. As the sole superpower, America now stood in solitary splendor, recognized by all as the indispensable nation, able to discern as it simultaneously embodied the right side of history. My text encloses those phrases in quotes. But during the 1990s, ostensibly serious people issuing such pronouncements did not intend to be ironic. They were merely reciting what had become the conventional wisdom. And as well they might. Expanding on or embroidering such themes got your books on bestseller lists, your columns in all the best newspapers, and your smiling face on the Sunday talk shows. My own favorite artifact of this era remains the New York Times Magazine dated March 28, 1999. The cover story featured an excerpt from the Lexus and the Olive Tree, Tom Friedman's just-released celebration of globalization as Americanization. And the cover itself purported to illustrate, I'm quoting the text on the cover now, what the world needs now. Alongside a photograph of a clenched fist adorned with the stars and stripes in brilliant red, white, and blue, appeared this text. For globalism to work, America can't be afraid to act like the almighty superpower that it is. This was the New York Times, mind you, not the Weekly Standard, not the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. More or less overlooked amidst all of this triumphalism was the fact that the other 20th century, the one in which promoting freedom had never figured as a priority, that 20th century continued without interruption. In Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the West Bank, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, the collapse of communism did not qualify as some sort of cosmic event. In such places, the competition to dominate Eurasia had been a sideshow, not the main event. So the remarkable events of 1989 notwithstanding, the long 20th century continued apace, drawing the almighty superpower ever more deeply into what was fast becoming one hell of a mess. For those with a taste for irony, try this one. 1989 was the year in which the USSR finally gave up the ghost. It was also the year of the first Persian Gulf War. One headache went away, another one was about to become a migraine. In making the case for war against Iraq back in 1990, George Herbert Walker Bush depicted Saddam Hussein as a Hitler-like menace. Neither the first time nor the last time, the infamous Fuhrer